A millionaire decides to get rid of his dog's 12 unwanted puppies by heartlessly throwing them into the trash. The cruel act catches the attention of a stranger, who finds the puppies and decides to save them. The São Paulo morning sun reflected off the enormous windows of James Wells's mansion, creating a spectacle of light that contrasted with the darkness inhabiting his heart. In his closet, while adjusting his custom-made Italian tie, he observed his reflection in the mirror, a 50-year-old man, well-trimmed grey hair, impeccable suit, and eyes that carried a sadness that all his money couldn't mask. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us what city you're watching us from. We continue. The sound of paws running along the Italian marble corridor caught his attention. Daisy, his little Shih Tzu, entered the closet wagging her tail, her bright eyes fixed on her owner with that unconditional adoration that only dogs can demonstrate. James allowed himself a brief smile, the only genuine moment in his mornings since his wife had left. "Good morning, little one," he murmured, bending down to briefly pet Daisy. The little dog had been his wife's last gift, an attempt to bring more life and love to that mansion that seemed more like a luxury museum than a home. "You need to learn to smile more, James," she used to say. "All this money is worth nothing if you don't know how to live." In the dining room, where a 12-person mahogany table served only him, James was having his breakfast while reading the news on his latest generation tablet. The headlines highlighted another of his generous donations to social causes, this time a cultural center in the outskirts of New York. The press portrayed him as an exemplary philanthropist, the successful businessman who didn't forget the less fortunate. "Sir, you have an interview with tomorrow's Entrepreneurs magazine at 10 a.m., reminded Regina, his personal assistant, entering the room with an electronic agenda in hand. "And after that, the charity lunch at the Happy Child Foundation." James merely nodded, already accustomed to his routine of carefully orchestrated commitments to maintain his public image. It was a well-mounted theater. The generous millionaire, the humane businessman, the dedicated philanthropist. No one needed to know about the loneliness that consumed him every night when the lights went out and he found himself alone in that immense mansion. Daisy was his only true companion, the only one who saw him without masks. In recent days, however, James had noticed changes in the little dog's behavior. She was quieter, seeking dark corners of the house, and her appetite had decreased. "Mr. Wells?" called Mary, the housekeeper who had worked in the mansion for years. "I think we should take Daisy to the vet. I have experience with animals, and she's showing signs that she might be..." "Might be what?" James interrupted, his voice betraying a concern he rarely showed. "Pregnant, sir. I believe Daisy is expecting puppies." The news hit James like a punch to the stomach. Puppies? His organized and methodical mind immediately began to calculate the implications. Noise, mess, extra responsibilities, everything he had managed to avoid in his perfectly controlled life. "But how? She barely leaves this house," he protested, abruptly rising from the table. "Remember that day a few weeks ago when the gardener left the gate open for a few minutes? Daisy escaped for a little while," explained Mary, with the patience of someone who knew her employer's moods well. James ran his hands over his face, trying to process the information. His life was an example of control and organization. Every minute of his day was planned, every decision was calculated, every movement was strategic. The idea of a litter of uncontrolled puppies running through his impeccable house was disturbing. That night, alone in his office, James watched Daisy sleeping in her designer bed. The small dog seemed plumper, and her sleep was deeper than normal. For a moment he remembered his wife's words when she brought Daisy home. "She'll bring life to this house, you'll see." Life. That's what was about to invade his perfectly organized world. Not a planned and controlled life like the ones he was used to managing in his companies, but life in its most chaotic and unpredictable form. As he finished his imported whiskey, James couldn't imagine that that small dog was about to unleash a series of events that would shake his seemingly perfect world to its foundations, forcing him to question not only his choices, but the very person he had become. The days that followed transformed the meticulous routine of the Wells mansion. James, accustomed to having control over every aspect of his life, now found himself at the mercy of the needs of a pregnant dog. Daisy had become more demanding, refusing the imported food she had always eaten. requesting attention at inconvenient times, and transforming various corners of the house into possible nests. "Sir, we need to prepare an adequate space for the birth," suggested Mary, while watching Daisy trying to make another nest behind the Italian sofa in the living room. "We can't let her have the puppies just anywhere in the house." James, who was in an important video conference with international investors, merely nodded, trying to maintain his concentration while Daisy whimpered insistently at his side. The meeting, which was supposed to seal $1 million deal, was interrupted several times by the dog's noises, causing condescending smiles from the businessman on the other side of the screen. "Wells, it seems you have an interesting situation on your hands," commented one of the investors, when Daisy started barking during a crucial explanation about financial projections. "Just a small domestic situation," he replied, feeling his face burn with frustration. James Wells wasn't used to losing control of anything, much less a business presentation. After the meeting, irritated by the setbacks, James called his assistant. "Regina, find the best veterinarian in New York. No matter the cost, I want someone who can handle this situation in the most discreet way possible." The veterinarian arrived the next day, Dr. Richard Sanders, a renowned professional who attended to the New York elite. After examining Daisy, he confirmed the pregnancy and gave the news that James feared to hear. "From the ultrasound, I can confirm that there are approximately 12 puppies," announced the veterinarian while showing the images on his tablet. "It's a considerable litter for a dog her size." 12? James almost choked on his coffee. Is that normal?" "It's not common, but it happens. We'll need special care. I suggest we transform one of the rooms into an adequate maternity ward. The temperature will need to be controlled. We'll need monitoring equipment." As the veterinarian listed all the needs, James felt his head spin. His mansion, his refuge of order and silence, was about to transform into a canine maternity ward. The sound of his Italian shoes echoed through the corridor as he walked restlessly, trying to process the situation. Mary, observing her employer's anguish, tried to calm him. "Mr. Wells, think that this would be something the madam would love. She always wanted to see this house more cheerful." The mention of his wife hit James like an arrow. Yes, she had always complained about the sepulchral silence of the mansion, the coldness of the perfectly decorated environments, the absence of real life amidst so much luxury. That's why she had brought Daisy, in an attempt to humanize that space. In the days that followed, the Wells mansion underwent a transformation. One of the guest rooms was completely adapted, with state-of-the-art equipment for monitoring, temperature control, and everything else that money could buy. James, in his eagerness for control, transformed what should have been a natural event into an almost surgical operation. The nights became more agitated. Daisy, previously discreet and obedient, now whimpered constantly, seeking James's attention at increasingly inconvenient times. He, who had always slept his precise 8 hours a night, began to have his sleep interrupted by the dog's calls. "You need to have patience, sir," advised Mary, seeing her employer increasingly irritated with the changes in his routine. "It's just a few months, then everything will go back to normal." But James Wells wasn't used to waiting. His entire life had been built on the premise of immediate control, of quick and efficient solutions to any problem. The idea of months of chaos in his perfectly organized house was beginning to seem unbearable. One night, during a charity dinner he was hosting in his mansion, Daisy began to bark insistently during an important speech. The guests, members of New York high society, exchanged looks of disapproval. James felt his face burn with shame as Mary rushed to calm the dog. It was that night, observing his reflection in the main bathroom mirror, that James began to consider alternatives. His eyes fell on a report on his phone about an animal shelter in the Catskill Mountains region. For a brief moment, a dark thought crossed his mind, but he quickly pushed it away. Still, as he listened to Daisy's barks echoing through the mansion, that thought persisted, like a seed planted in fertile soil, ready to germinate in the shadows of his troubled conscience. The early morning arrived with a storm that lashed the windows of the Wells mansion. The sound of rain mingled with Daisy's low moans, who had gone into labor. James, awakened by the persistent noises, nervously paced the room transformed into a canine maternity ward, while Dr. Sanders and his team monitored every movement of the little Shih Tzu. "Is all this delay normal?" James asked for the 5th time in less than an hour, his normally controlled face now showing clear signs of anxiety. "Each birth has its own time, Mr. Wells," the veterinarian patiently replied, adjusting the monitors. With a litter this size, it can take several hours. Mary remained by Daisy's side, whispering words of comfort and stroking her head. The housekeeper, who had always maintained a professional and distant posture, now showed a tenderness that James had never noticed before. The hours dragged on like decades. One by one, the puppies began to arrive. First one, then another and another. James watched, mixing fascination and horror, as his impeccable house transformed into the scene of an event that completely escaped his control. "It's 12 puppies, Mr. Wells," Dr. Sanders finally announced, after what seemed like an eternity. All healthy and strong. 12. The number echoed in James's mind like a sentence. 12 little creatures that now depended on constant care. 12 sources of noise, mess, and unpredictability in his meticulously organized world. In the days that followed, the Wells mansion transformed into utter chaos. The puppies, still blind and completely dependent, needed feeding every 2 hours. The constant crying echoed through the corridors, disturbing James's important business calls. "Sir, we need more towels," informed Regina, his assistant, trying to maintain her composure while one of the puppies squirmed in her arms. "And, Dr. Sanders suggested we buy some more monitoring equipment." James signed checks automatically, as if money could solve the situation, but each day brought new challenges. The puppies began to open their eyes, and with that came the first attempts at exploration. The prepared room was no longer enough to contain them. One morning, as he came down for his usual coffee, James found his living room, decorated with rare pieces and exclusive design furniture, transformed into a canine playground. Mary had improvised enclosures with expensive pillows, and the puppies, now more active, played happily, oblivious to the value of the objects surrounding them. "I'm sorry, sir," Mary hurried to explain, "but they needed more space. The room was getting too small." James felt his face burn with frustration. His house, his refuge of order and elegance, was gradually being taken over by chaos. The puppies' barks echoed through the corridors, mixing with the sound of the million-dollar negotiations he was trying to conduct. During a particularly important video conference with Chinese investors, one of the puppies managed to escape from the enclosure and invaded his office, knocking over a valuable sculpture. The sound of the object breaking was amplified by the microphones, causing embarrassment and laughter on the other side of the screen. "It seems you've got your hands full, Wells," commented one of the investors, barely containing his smile. That night, alone in his office, James contemplated the city through the windows while drinking his imported whiskey. The sound of the puppies playing upstairs seemed to pierce his mind like sharp needles. His phone wouldn't stop vibrating with messages from Regina about more needs for the puppies, more special food, more vitamins, more veterinary consultations. It was then that his eyes landed again on the report about the shelter in the Catskill Mountains, still open on his tablet. The idea that was once just a seed began to grow, fueled by frustration and desperation at seeing his perfectly controlled world crumble. "Mr. Wells?" Mary's voice brought him back to reality. "Daisy is calling for you. She always calms down when you're around." James closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of his future choices beginning to accumulate on his shoulders. Upstairs, Daisy's soft cry continued, like a silent plea for attention and love. In the meeting room of Wells Enterprises, the silence was cutting. James observed the tense faces of his executives as they presented the latest financial reports. The deep dark circles under his eyes betrayed the sleepless nights, between barks and cries of the puppies that had transformed his mansion into an improvised kennel. "Mr. Wells," his financial director began, "the Chinese investors are concerned after the incident in the last video conference. They question whether this is the right time to proceed with the merger." James pinched the bridge of his nose, trying to contain his growing frustration. The merger with the Chinese conglomerate was a years-long project, a negotiation that could double the value of his company. And now, everything was at risk because of 12 little invaders who had taken over his life. "Schedule a new meeting with them," he ordered dryly. In person this time, in Shanghai. Returning home that night, he found his living room, once an example of elegance and sophistication, transformed into a veritable canine nursery. Toys scattered everywhere, suspicious stains on the Persian rugs, and the smell, that smell that no imported cleaning product could completely mask. "Mary!" he called, his voice echoing through the corridors. "What happened here?" The housekeeper appeared, carrying 2 agitated puppies in her arms. "I'm sorry, sir. They're more active now. They need space to exercise. We tried to keep them in the room, but what? This is my house, not an animal shelter." James exploded, frightening the puppies, who began to whine. The high-pitched sound pierced his ears like needles. At that moment, Daisy appeared, walking calmly towards him. Her eyes, full of that unconditional devotion that only dogs can demonstrate, met James's. For an instant, he felt a pang of guilt for the outburst. "You need to have patience, sir," Mary tried to argue. "They're just babies. They'll grow and how long will that take?" James interrupted. "How long until my house returns to normal? Until I can have a meeting without being interrupted by barking? Until I can sleep a full night?" Regina, his assistant, chose that moment to enter with another list of expenses: special food, vitamins, vaccines, veterinary consultations. The numbers were adding up, not that money was a problem for James Wells, but each figure seemed to mock his inability to maintain control over his own life. Going up to his room, James stopped in the hallway upon hearing a familiar sound. It was Daisy, softly crooning to her puppies, a sound that should be comforting, but now only increased his anguish. In his closet, while changing out of his suit stained by dirty paws, his eyes fell on an old photo of him with his wife. She was smiling, holding Daisy as a puppy in her arms. "She'll bring life to this house," her words echoed in his memory. Life. Yes, there was too much life now. Chaotic, uncontrolled, unpredictable life. Everything that James Wells had always avoided in his meticulously planned existence. That night, as he tried to work in his office, the sound of the puppies playing upstairs was like constant torture. His phone vibrated. It was another message from the Chinese investor, questioning his ability to manage the $1 million merger. It was then that James made his decision. With trembling fingers, he searched again about the shelter in the Catskill Mountains. The region was isolated, perfect for... No, he couldn't think of it as abandonment. It was just a necessary relocation. Daisy would find a new home, a more suitable place for her and her puppies. "It's best for everyone," he murmured to himself, as if trying to convince himself. Upstairs, Daisy's soft song continued, oblivious to the plans forming in her owner's mind. James began to plan meticulously, as he did with all his business. He studied routes, schedules, locations. It needed to be quick, discreet, efficient, like a business operation, with no room for emotions or regrets. As he organized the details in his mind, the sound of paws approaching made him freeze. Daisy was at the office door, carrying one of her puppies in her mouth, as if wanting to introduce him to the owner once again. The day dawned gray over New York City, as if the sky itself sensed what was to come. James Wells woke up before his alarm, after a restless night's sleep. The plan he had devised over the past few days weighed on his conscience like lead. He dressed mechanically, choosing inconspicuous clothes instead of his usual Italian suits. In the mirror, his reflection showed a different man from the powerful businessman he was used to seeing. There was something somber in his eyes, an expression he preferred not to analyze too deeply. "Sir, breakfast is served," announced Mary, entering the room. "And the puppies have already had their first feeding of the morning. Daisy is being an excellent mother." James merely nodded, avoiding looking directly at the housekeeper. In recent days, he had been careful to maintain an apparently normal routine, so as not to raise suspicions. He had even authorized the purchase of more supplies for the puppies, as if he planned to keep them. "Mary, you can take the day off today," he said, keeping his voice controlled. "Regina, too. I have some important meetings and need privacy." The housekeeper hesitated for a moment, something in her instinct alerting her that something wasn't right. But years of service had taught her not to question her employer's decisions. As soon as he was alone, James went down to the garage. He had chosen his least conspicuous car, a domestic model in a discreet color. The night before, he had set aside a large cardboard box, the kind used to transport office equipment. His stomach contracted as he looked at it. Back in the house, he found Daisy and the puppies in the room improvised as a maternity ward. The little dog greeted him with her usual enthusiasm, wagging her tail and trying to lick his hands. The puppies, now more active, played with each other, oblivious to the fate that awaited them. "Come, Daisy," he called, his voice faltering slightly. "Let's go for a walk." With studied care, James began to place the puppies in the box. Each small body his hands touched seemed to burn his conscience. Daisy watched curiously, still fully trusting her owner, occasionally approaching to check on her babies. The journey to the car was the longest of his life. Each step echoed through the empty corridors of the mansion, amplifying the weight of his decision. Daisy followed him cheerfully, probably imagining it was just another of the walks they used to take together. As he placed the box in the back seat of the car, James felt his hands tremble. Daisy jumped into the vehicle with the same confidence as always, settling close to her puppies. For a moment, her eyes met his in the rearview mirror, eyes full of love and unconditional loyalty. The journey to the Catskills was made in a disturbing silence, broken only by the occasional whimpers of the puppies and the soft sounds Daisy made to calm them. James kept his eyes fixed on the road, trying not to think, not to feel. When he reached the chosen location, an isolated clearing he had discovered in his research, the sun was still struggling to break through the grey clouds. James parked the car and sat motionless for a few minutes, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. With movements that seemed to belong to someone else, he got out of the car and opened the back door. Daisy looked at him, still confident, still believing that this was just another adventure with her beloved owner. The box with the puppies weighed tons in his arms as he walked to the clearing. Daisy followed him, occasionally looking back towards the car, as if expecting they would soon return home. As he placed the box on the ground, James felt something inside him break. Daisy immediately approached, checking on her puppies, beginning to organize the space around the box as she had done so many times at home. It was at this moment that their eyes met for the last time. There was a silent question in Daisy's eyes, an innocent confusion that James knew would haunt him for the rest of his life. The return to the mansion was a blur in James Wells's memory. The silence in the car, once so desired, now screamed in his ears. Each curve of the road seemed more difficult than the previous one, as if the path itself protested against his action. As he entered his immaculate house, the emptiness hit him like a wave. The scattered toys were still there, the stains on the Persian rugs, the small signs of life that had bothered him so much. But now each object seemed like a silent accusation. The phone rang, breaking the sepulchral silence. It was Regina, his assistant. "Mr. Wells, the Chinese investors have confirmed the meeting in Shanghai for next week. Should I arrange the tickets?" "Yes," he replied mechanically, his voice sounding strange even to himself. "Arrange everything." In the Catskills, Daisy faced her first night in the open. Maternal instinct kept her alert, organizing and reorganizing the box where her puppies huddled together for warmth. The temperature was starting to drop, and the cold mountain wind penetrated the thin cardboard walls. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Mary returned from her unexpected day off and immediately sensed something was wrong. The silence was different, too heavy. "Mr. Wells," she called, her heart racing as she noticed the absence of familiar barks. "Where is Daisy and the puppies?" James was in his office, an untouched glass of whiskey in front of him. "They found a new home," he replied, without looking at the housekeeper. "It was for the best." Mary brought her hands to her mouth, instantly comprehending what had happened. Tears began to well up in her eyes, but she held them back, years of service preventing her from openly expressing her horror. You didn't do that," she murmured, her voice trembling. "You're dismissed for today, Mary." James cut her off, still not looking at her. "Please close the door on your way out." In the mountains, the night advanced mercilessly. Daisy, exhausted but determined, used her own body to protect the puppies from the cold. Her instincts alerted her to the dangers of the forest, unfamiliar sounds that made her shudder. Still, she maintained her vigil, occasionally looking in the direction where James's car had disappeared, as if expecting him to return at any moment. Back at the mansion, James tried to concentrate on financial reports, but the words danced meaninglessly before his eyes. The silence, once so precious, now suffocated him. Each empty room seemed to echo with memories of the previous days. In his bedroom, upon opening a drawer, he found a small toy of Daisy's that had escaped the cleanup. It was a rubber bone, worn from constant use. His hands trembled as he touched it, and for the first time since he had made his decision, James Wells allowed a solitary tear to trickle down his face. In the mountains, a distant thunder announced the arrival of a storm. Daisy pulled the cardboard box with her teeth, dragging it under a tree in a desperate attempt to protect her puppies from the approaching rain. The first drops began to fall, thick and cold, quickly soaking the cardboard. The puppies, frightened by the thunder, huddled against each other, seeking comfort in their mother's warmth. Daisy, soaked but resolute, remained firm in her mission to protect them. At the mansion, James heard the same storm through the thick walls. Each thunder seemed to carry with it the echo of the puppies' whimpers, each raindrop a reminder of Daisy's trusting gaze in their last moments together. Helen Baker woke up before the sun, as she had done for decades. Her small farm in the Catskills was a refuge for dozens of rescued animals, each with its story of abandonment and overcoming. As she prepared the first meal of the day for her protégés, she heard the sound of rain that had battered the region throughout the night. "I need to check if any little creature needed shelter during the storm," she murmured to herself, putting on her worn-out galoshes and grabbing a patched umbrella. Her morning routine included a walk around her property. At 65, Helen maintained the energy and determination of a young woman, especially when it came to rescuing animals in need. Her grey hair and time-worn face hid an inner strength that impressed all who knew her. As she walked along the muddy trail, her experienced eyes examined every corner, every bush. Years of dedication to abandoned animals had sharpened her senses for signs of life in danger. It was then that she heard it, a weak cry, almost imperceptible, coming from a nearby clearing. Her heart, already so many times broken by stories of abandonment, tightened in her chest. "Oh my God," she whispered, as she approached and found Daisy and her puppies. The cardboard box was completely soaked, practically undone by the rain. The small Shih Tzu, still trying to protect her babies with her own body, was shaking violently. "Come, little ones," Helen called with her soft voice, approaching cautiously. Daisy, exhausted and frightened, still tried to remain protective, but something in the lady's gaze made her relax slightly. With infinite care, Helen began to gather the puppies, placing them in her old but warm coat. Daisy, perceiving the gentleness in the lady's gestures, allowed the approach, her eyes pleading for help. "What monster did this to you?" murmured Helen, noticing Daisy's purebred features and the well-cared-for state of her coat, clear signs that she was not a street dog. "Come, my dear, let's take care of you and your little babies." At the Wells mansion, James tried to concentrate on an important video conference, but his mind kept returning to the mountains. The sound of rain the night before had been torturous, each drop a reminder of what he had done. Meanwhile, at Helen's farm, Daisy and her puppies received their first care. The lady, with her years of experience rescuing animals, knew exactly what to do. She improvised a warm, dry bed in her own room, prepared warm milk for the exhausted mother, and examined each puppy carefully. "You're a warrior, little one," she spoke to Daisy, who was gradually beginning to show trust in her savior. "You protected your babies like a true mother." Helen was known in the region not only for her work with abandoned animals, but also for her active presence on social media. With her old cell phone always at hand, she documented each rescue, each story, mobilizing a network of supporters who helped with donations and shares. "I need to tell this story," she decided, picking up her phone. "Who knows, we might find who did this or at least get help to care for this family." With fingers calloused from work but agile on social media, Helen began to write a post that would change many lives. "We wake up to another case of heartbreaking cruelty. A Shih Tzu mother and her 12 puppies were found abandoned in the mountains, left to face last night's storm in a simple cardboard box. By the mother's appearance, she came from a wealthy home, where she was well cared for until being discarded like trash, along with her babies." Helen's post went viral on social media with surprising speed. In a few hours, the photos of Daisy protecting her puppies in the soaked box had been shared thousands of times. The story of the small Shih Tzu who had faced the storm to save her babies touched hearts across the country. "Ms. Helen, you won't believe it," exclaimed Julia, a young volunteer veterinarian who always helped with rescues. "The post already has over 50,000 shares. People are asking how they can help." The lady, more accustomed to caring for animals than dealing with such virtual repercussion, smiled as she stroked Daisy, who was nursing her puppies in a warm corner of the house. "The important thing is that they're safe now," she replied, but her heart rejoiced at the possibility of getting help to cover the necessary treatments. Meanwhile, at Wells Enterprises, James tried to maintain his composure during an important board meeting when his cell phone began to vibrate insistently. Regina, his assistant, entered the room with a worried expression. "Mr. Wells, I think you need to see this," she said, handing him a tablet with the viral post open. "It's circulating in all the business groups." James felt his blood run cold as he saw the photos. There was Daisy, her coat soaked, her eyes exhausted but determined, protecting her puppies. The box he had chosen, now destroyed by the rain, was perfectly recognizable in the images. "The meeting is adjourned," he announced abruptly, rising under the surprised glances of the directors. In his office, James watched with growing horror as comments multiplied. People from all over the country expressed their outrage, promising to find the person responsible for the abandonment. Some comments speculated about the dog's origin, noting her purebred traits and evident previous care. "How can someone be so cruel?" said one comment with thousands of likes. "This little dog clearly had a home, someone with money to care for her. What kind of monster does this?" At Helen's farm, local journalists began to arrive, attracted by the story's repercussion. The lady, with her characteristic simplicity, conducted interviews without fanfare, always focused on the animal's well-being. "What matters to me is that they are receiving love and care now," she declared to a local TV reporter. "But yes, it's important that this story be told. We need to raise awareness about the responsibility of having an animal." Donations started to arrive. Moved people sent money, food, medicines. Veterinarians offered free care. Pet shops donated products. Daisy's story was mobilizing a chain of solidarity that surprised even Helen, accustomed to fighting alone for her rescues. James observed all of this with a mixture of guilt and dread. Each new report, each indignant comment, was like a stab in his conscience. The post had reached business groups, and some colleagues were already commenting on the case during business calls. "It must be someone from that region," speculated an investor during a video conference. "By the animal's breed and the location, probably someone from the luxury condominiums near the mountains." The siege was beginning to close in, and James felt the weight of his actions increasing with each hour. Mary, his housekeeper, avoided looking directly at him, and the silence of the mansion, once so desired, now seemed to suffocate him. In a moment of desperation, he began to research Helen and her farm. The lady's social media was full of rescue stories, years of dedication to abandoned animals. In each photo with Daisy and the puppies, he could see the care and love that now surrounded those he had discarded. On the screen of James Wells' computer, the words of the latest report about Daisy seemed to jump out at him. Businessmen in the region mobilized to find the person responsible for the abandonment. The article featured new photos of the puppies, now recovered and playful at Helen's farm, and a moving interview with the lady. "I'm not seeking revenge," Helen said in the interview. "I just want this story to serve as an example, for people to understand that animals are not objects we can discard when they become inconvenient." James turned off the monitor and walked to the window of his office. Outside, the day was exceptionally beautiful, contrasting with the storm forming inside him. Helen's words echoed in his mind, mixing with memories of Daisy's trusting gaze on that fateful morning. "Sir," Regina called from the door, hesitant. "The Chinese investors cancelled the meeting in Shanghai. They said they prefer to wait until the situation in the region calms down. Apparently, the abandonment story reached them." James merely nodded, dismissing the assistant with a gesture. His reputation, built over years as a philanthropic and socially responsible businessman, was at risk. But for the first time, that wasn't what worried him most. After hours of restlessness, he made a decision. He picked up the phone and, with trembling fingers, dialed the number he had found on the donation website for Helen's farm. "Hello?" The lady's gentle voice answered after a few rings. "Ms. Baker?" His voice came out hoarser than usual. "My name is James Wells. I saw the news about the little dog and the puppies. I'd like to help." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. When Helen spoke again, her voice had a different tone, as if she sensed something between the lines. "You're the businessman from the reports about social works, aren't you?" "Yes," he replied, feeling a lump in his throat. I'd like to make a substantial donation to help with the animals' care. Could you come to the farm in person? Helen asked, her voice now loaded with a wisdom that made James shudder. I believe it would be important for you to see our work and our refugees. The suggestion caught James by surprise. The idea of personally facing the consequences of his actions wasn't in his plans. But something in Helen's voice, a mixture of firmness and compassion, left him no alternative. I can come today, he replied, surprising himself. During the journey to the farm, each mile seemed more difficult than the last. The path was the same he had traveled on that terrible morning, but now each turn brought with it the weight of guilt and regret. As he parked his imported car in front of Helen's simple but welcoming house, James felt his heart race. The sound of happy barks came from all sides, and in the air there was an atmosphere of peace that strongly contrasted with the cold luxury of his mansion. Helen was waiting for him on the porch, her face marked by time showing a serenity that only years of dedication to animals could provide. Her eyes, however, had a perceptive gleam that seemed to see beyond appearances. Welcome, Mr. Wells, she said, extending a hand calloused by work. Would you like to meet our family? Helen guided James through the farm, showing the various spaces where rescued animals found shelter and affection. The businessman observed everything with a mixture of admiration and guilt, noticing how each corner, although simple, overflowed with love and care. Each of them has a story, Helen explained, as they passed by improvised but clean and welcoming kennels. Some were abandoned as puppies, others already elderly, when they became an inconvenience to their owners. James felt each word like a pin in his conscience. The contrast between the luxury of his mansion and the simplicity full of life in this place was striking. Here, even with limited resources, there was more humanity than in all his square meters of Italian marble. And here, said Helen, stopping in front of a specially prepared space, is our most recent family. James's heart stopped for a moment. There was Daisy, lying on a comfortable bed, surrounded by her puppies, now stronger and more playful. Upon seeing him, the little dog raised her head, her eyes fixed on his. It's incredible how she protected all of them during that storm, Helen continued, closely observing James's reaction. You know, Mr. Wells, animals have an extraordinary capacity for unconditional love. Even when they're betrayed, they're still capable of forgiving. James couldn't take his eyes off Daisy. The little dog, who used to run happily to greet him at home, now kept her distance, her eyes revealing a mixture of fear and confusion that broke his heart. Can I approach?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Helen nodded but warned, "Slowly. She's been through a very big trauma. We need to respect her time." James took a hesitant step towards the enclosure. Daisy stood up, positioning herself protectively in front of her puppies. The businessman felt tears forming in his eyes. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to show vulnerability. "Forgive me, little one," he murmured, kneeling near the enclosure. It was then that one of the puppies, curious and oblivious to the tension of the moment, stumbled towards James, crossing under the fence. It was the smallest of the litter, with a small white spot on its chest that set it apart from its siblings. "This is the bravest one," Helen commented with a smile. "He fought the hardest to survive that night." James watched the small puppy approach, its tiny heart beating so hard it was visible through the thin fur. Carefully, he extended his hand, allowing the puppy to sniff him. Daisy watched everything attentively, still wary, but something in the interaction between her puppy and James seemed to awaken old memories. Slowly, very slowly, she took a step towards her former owner. "It's extraordinary," Helen whispered, "how love can build bridges even over the greatest chasms." James felt a tear roll down his face when Daisy, after what seemed like an eternity, finally came close enough to sniff his hand. There wasn't the old joy in her gestures, but there wasn't anger either, just caution mixed with something that seemed like hope. "Ms. Baker," said James, his voice choked with emotion, "I need to tell you something." Helen observed James for a long moment, her wise eyes studying the powerful man who now appeared so vulnerable before her. The puppy was still playing at his feet, oblivious to the tension of the moment, while Daisy maintained a cautious distance. "I know who you are," she said softly, surprising James. "Not just the businessman from the headlines, but the man who left Daisy and her puppies in that clearing." James felt his legs weaken, needing to lean on the kennel fence for support. "How? Years of caring for abandoned animals have taught me to recognize the signs," she explained, her voice without judgment, only a deep understanding. "The way Daisy reacted when she saw you, your guilty look, your generous donation, and mainly the fact that you came here." The businessman lowered his head, feeling the weight of his actions more than ever. The puppy was now biting the hem of his expensive imported suit pants, leaving small teeth marks on the fine fabric. "I didn't come here to denounce you or expose you," continued Helen, sitting on a simple wooden bench and inviting James to do the same. "I came because I believe people can change, can learn from their mistakes, and you're here, aren't you?" At that moment, other puppies began to approach, curious about the new visitor. Daisy, still vigilant, allowed the approach, but her eyes never left James for a second. I lost control," he confessed, the words coming out like a long-dammed torrent. "My life was always so organized, so predictable. When the puppies arrived, everything turned into chaos. I didn't know how to handle it. I did something terrible." Helen listened in silence, letting James pour out all the anguish he had been carrying. As he spoke, more puppies ventured towards him, some already climbing on his Italian shoes, leaving paw prints on the expensive suede. "You know, Mr. Wells," she said finally, "sometimes we need to lose control to find what really matters. Look at these puppies. They know nothing about status, money, or power. They only know about unconditional love." James observed the little ones around him, their hearts beating fearlessly, their gazes pure and trusting. At some point, without realizing it, he had begun to pet one of them, which had fallen asleep in his lap. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice betraying the fear of consequences. "That depends on you," replied Helen. "I could call the police, expose your story on the social networks where it all began. It would be the easiest thing. But it wouldn't be the right thing." Daisy, as if understanding the gravity of the conversation, came a little closer, her eyes meeting James's with an intensity that made him shiver. "Or," continued the lady, "you can choose a different path. You can use your resources, your influence to make a difference, not just for Daisy and her puppies, but for all animals that need help." The businessman looked around, seeing for the first time the true dimension of Helen's work. Every corner of the farm sheltered a story of abandonment, but also of hope and recovery. "What do you suggest?" he asked, feeling for the first time in a long time that he was about to make a truly important decision in his life. "An NGO," said Helen, petting Daisy, who was now closer. "With your resources and my experience, we could create something much bigger than this farm. A true rescue and rehabilitation center." James looked around, his businessman's mind already beginning to calculate possibilities. The puppy in his lap stretched, involuntarily drawing a smile from his lips. "But it wouldn't be just about money," continued the lady, her penetrating gaze fixed on James. "It would need to be a true commitment, a real change in your life." At that moment, Daisy came even closer, sniffing James's hand. There was still distrust in her movements, but also something more, a willingness to start over. "Where do we begin?" he asked, feeling that each word committed him to a path of no return. "First," replied Helen, "we need to resolve the most immediate issue, the viral post, the speculations. People deserve to know the truth." James felt a chill down his spine. "You want me to confess publicly?" "I want you to transform your mistake into a lesson for others," she explained. "Your story can prevent other animals from going through the same thing Daisy and her puppies went through." In the days that followed, James immersed himself in a completely new world. Accompanied by Helen, he visited other shelters, learned stories of abandonment and rescue, saw up close the reality he had previously preferred to ignore. In his mansion, for the first time in years, he held a different kind of meeting. Instead of businessmen and investors, his living room was occupied by veterinarians, animal protectors, and animal welfare specialists. "We need adequate facilities," explained a veterinarian, unrolling plans and projects on the coffee table. "A surgical center, recovery area, space for socialization." Mary, the housekeeper, observed everything with a discreet smile on her lips, noticing the change in her employer. James, always so formal and distant, now sat on the floor to discuss projects, his expensive Italian suits covered in animal fur. At the farm, Daisy continued her healing process. Each visit from James was a small step towards rebuilding lost trust. The puppies, now stronger and more playful, had no reservations about showing affection for the man who had once abandoned them. "They teach us about forgiveness," commented Helen, observing the interaction. "Without judgments, without resentment, just pure love and the ability to start over." James's transformation did not go unnoticed in the business world. His schedule, previously dedicated exclusively to business meetings, now included visits to shelters, participation in adoption events, and meetings with animal protectors. "Are you sure about this, sir?" asked Regina, his assistant, when he cancelled an important international trip to accompany an emergency surgery on one of Daisy's puppies. "For the first time in my life, Regina," he replied, watching the little one being prepared for surgery, "I am absolutely sure of what I'm doing." Businessman James Wells reveals, "I was the man who abandoned Daisy." The headline exploded on social media on a Monday morning, generating a storm of reactions. The exclusive interview given to one of the country's leading newspapers brought the businessman's full confession. "I'm not here seeking forgiveness or understanding," James said in the interview. "I'm here to take responsibility and turn my mistake into something positive for other animals." At Helen's farm, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Journalists, celebrities, and businessmen all wanted to know more about the story that had moved the country. The lady, with her characteristic wisdom, carefully filtered the requests. "We don't want a circus," she explained to James. "We want true awareness." The public reaction was intense and divided. While some harshly condemned the businessman, others recognized the courage to publicly admit the mistake and seek reparation. Social media was boiling with divergent opinions. "How can he redeem himself after what he did?" some questioned. "At least he's trying to fix it. How many others would do the same?" Others defended. Amid the media storm, James kept his focus on what really mattered. The NGO project was advancing rapidly, with the construction of a modern animal rescue and rehabilitation center on land near Helen's farm. "Mr. Wells," called one of the architects during a project meeting, "we managed to integrate all the technical specifications that Ms. Baker suggested. It will be the most complete animal rehabilitation center in North America." Daisy and her puppies became the symbol of the project. The before and after photos, showing the little ones abandoned in the rain and now healthy and happy, touched hearts and inspired more people to help. One afternoon, while supervising the construction of the new center, James received an unexpected call. It was one of the Chinese investors who had cancelled the meeting weeks ago. "Mr. Wells, we have followed your story with interest," said the investor. "We would like to contribute to your project. Our company has a social responsibility program, and we believe your initiative deserves support." The news of the Chinese investor's $1 million donation opened doors for other partnerships. Businessmen who previously only cared about profits began to see value in associating their brands with a genuine cause. At home, James had completely transformed his routine. The office, once sacred and silent, now had a bed for Daisy and her puppies, who were gradually learning to trust him again. During important video calls, it wasn't uncommon to see one of the little ones sleeping on his lap. "You've changed, sir," Mary commented one morning, finding James playing with the puppies in the garden, his Italian suit covered in mud and fur. "No, Mary," he replied, smiling as he watched Daisy approach with increasing confidence. "I just found who I really should be." James Wells' transformation became the subject of motivational speeches and case studies at universities. How could a man who had everything find his true purpose through an act of repentance and redemption? The Wells Baker Animal Rehabilitation Center was growing visibly. What had begun as a project of personal redemption was becoming a national reference in the care and protection of abandoned animals. The modern facilities harmonized perfectly with the nature of the Catskills, creating a welcoming environment for both animals and volunteers. "Look at this," commented Helen, observing the intense movement of veterinarians, handlers, and volunteers. From a cardboard box in the rain, all of this was born. James, who personally supervised every detail of the construction, smiled as he watched Daisy running through the new socialization space with her puppies, now grown and full of energy. The trust between them had been gradually rebuilt, day by day, moment by moment. "I received 3 more requests for social franchising of the project," commented Regina, who now divided her time between traditional business and NGO management. Businessmen from other states want to replicate the model. The concept of social franchising, developed by James with Helen's guidance, allowed other businessmen to open similar centers in their regions, following the same standards of quality and dedication to animals. But not just anyone can participate, James explained during a meeting with potential partners. We don't just want investors, we want people committed to the cause. One of the most emotional moments was when the first of Daisy's puppies was adopted. After a rigorous selection process, a family had been chosen to give a new home to the little one. James felt his heart tighten as he watched the puppy leave, but Daisy's smile, serene and confident, reassured him. They grow up and follow their paths, said Helen, noticing his emotion. Just like us. The center also became a space for education and awareness. Schools regularly scheduled visits, allowing children to learn about responsibility and love for animals. James, surprising everyone including himself, discovered that he loved giving talks to the young visitors. You know, kids, he would say, sitting on the floor with Daisy by his side, sometimes we need to make a really big mistake to learn how to do the right thing. Mary, who continued to work at the Wells mansion, now transformed into a more welcoming and lively space, observed with satisfaction the changes in her employer. The cold and distant man had given way to someone who smiled more, who allowed himself to feel, who wasn't afraid to show affection. One afternoon, as James worked in his office, now decorated with photos of rescued animals, Daisy entered carrying something in her mouth. It was the old rubber bone, the same one he had found in the drawer after abandoning her. "You kept this?" he asked, moved, taking the worn toy. Daisy responded by jumping into his lap, something she hadn't done since before the abandonment. It was as if that moment symbolized the closing of a cycle, the conclusion of a journey of forgiveness and reconstruction. "Mr. Wells," called one of the veterinarians on the team, interrupting the moment. "We need you in the rescue area. A complicated case just arrived." James got up immediately, Daisy at his heels. Together they headed for another rescue, another chance to transform a sad story into a new beginning full of hope. The afternoon sun painted the New York sky in shades of orange, as James Wells took the stage at the country's largest animal protection congress. The auditorium was packed, veterinarians, activists, businessmen, and curious onlookers, all eager to hear the story that had become a national phenomenon. By his side, Helen smiled serenely, her white hair reflecting the stage light. In the front row, Daisy rested peacefully, watching her former owner with eyes that now overflowed with renewed trust. "A year ago," James began, his voice heavy with emotion, "I was a different man, someone who measured success in numbers, who saw life as a sequence of goals to be achieved." The audience listened in absolute silence, many already knowing the story, but eager to hear its conclusion from the source. "It took losing my humanity for a moment," he continued, "to truly find it. It took making a terrible mistake to learn the real meaning of redemption." On the screen behind him, images of the Wells Baker Animal Rehabilitation Center succeeded one another. Hundreds of success stories, rescued animals, families completed through responsible adoption. "In 1 year, we rescued more than 1,000 animals," he reported, his voice breaking slightly. "But more important than the numbers, we transformed lives, not just theirs, but ours too." Regina, seated in the front row next to Mary, smiled as she saw her former boss so transformed. The man who once only talked about profits and acquisitions was now moving an entire audience talking about love and compassion. "The center is not just a rescue facility," he explained. "It's a space of transformation. Each animal that comes to us carries a story of pain, but also an opportunity for a new beginning." The images on the screen changed, showing the new centers that were beginning to emerge in other cities, the result of the social franchise program. The model created by James and Helen was spreading, bringing hope far beyond the Catskills. "But none of this would be possible," said James, making a significant pause, "without a small warrior who taught me the meaning of forgiveness." Daisy, as if understanding that they were talking about her, raised her head and looked directly at James. Her eyes, once marked by fear and distrust, now shone with unconditional love. "Each animal we rescue," he continued, "reminds me of that stormy night. It makes me think of how many other Daisies are out there, needing a second chance. And that's why we can't stop. The audience rose in emotional applause. Helen, with tears in her eyes, watched the man who had arrived at her farm carrying guilt and fear, and who now inspired so many people to make a difference. On the eve of the rehabilitation center's first anniversary, James Wells walked through the corridors of the complex, observing the movement of employees and volunteers preparing for the grand celebration the next day. In every corner there was a story of overcoming, a memory of transformation. "Mr. Wells," called one of the veterinarians, "come see this." He followed her to the maternity ward, where a new rescue had just given birth. The scene instantly transported him back to that night with Daisy, but now the scenario couldn't be more different. Instead of a cardboard box in the rain, there was a prepared team, modern equipment, and above all, love and care. 12 puppies, commented the veterinarian. Exactly like Daisy, he completed, feeling a lump in his throat. At that moment, as if summoned by memory, Daisy entered the room. Now a constant presence at the center, she had become a kind of godmother to the new rescues, especially mothers with puppies. She approached the new mom with that wisdom that only experience can bring. "It's amazing how she knows exactly what to do," observed Helen, who had arrived silently. "Every mother we rescue, every puppy that's born, she's there, caring, teaching." James watched the scene with misty eyes. The contrast between the past and present couldn't be more significant. His mansion, once a symbol of material success, now regularly hosted adoption events and meetings with animal protectors. "You know, James," said Helen, using his first name for the first time, "when you showed up that morning at my farm, I saw something in your eyes beyond guilt. I saw potential for change." Daisy's puppies, now grown, had found loving homes except for 2 of them that James decided to keep with him. The smallest of the litter, the one that first approached him on that crucial day, had become his inseparable companion during the long hours of work at the center. "Sometimes," the lady continued, "we need to completely lose ourselves to truly find ourselves." The center had become much more than a rescue facility. It was a space of transformation where people rediscovered their humanity through love for animals. Businessmen who once only thought about profits now dedicated time and resources to the cause. Children learned about compassion and responsibility. "Tomorrow," said James, watching Daisy guide the new mother in her first moments with the puppies, "when all those people are here to celebrate the center's anniversary, I want them to know that this place was born from a story of repentance and forgiveness." Helen smiled, that wise smile that had guided so many transformations. "And of love, James. Above all, of love." On the corridor wall, a photo caught visitors' attention, the image of Daisy on that stormy night, protecting her puppies in the cardboard box. Next to it, a current photo showed her surrounded by dozens of rescued animals, living symbols of hope and new beginnings. On the morning of the Wells Baker Rehabilitation Center's first anniversary, the sun shone with special intensity over the Catskills. The space, usually tranquil, was buzzing with activity. Hundreds of people, including volunteers, adopting families, supporters, and curious onlookers, arrived for the grand celebration. James Wells, wearing a simple t-shirt with the center's logo, quite different from the Italian suits that were once his trademark, walked around greeting everyone. Daisy faithfully followed him, no longer with the distrust of before, but with the certainty of one who had found her true purpose alongside her recovered human. "Look who's here," exclaimed Helen, pointing to an arriving group. It was the families who had adopted Daisy's puppies, bringing them for the special reunion. One by one, the 10 puppies that had found new homes arrived with their adoptive families. Daisy, upon seeing her now grown and happy babies, wagged her tail with quiet joy. "It's incredible how they remember her," commented one of the veterinarians, observing the puppies running to greet their mother. On the stage set up for the event, photos told the center's story. From that first painful image of Daisy in the rain to the most recent successful rescues. Over 1,000 stories of transformation, each carrying a bit of the DNA from that first stormy night. "Mr. Wells," called Regina, now executive director of the NGO, "it's time for your speech." James climbed onto the stage, but this time he wasn't alone. Daisy accompanied him, along with his 2 puppies that remained with him, and Helen, the woman who had transformed his mistake into redemption. "A year ago," he began, his voice echoing through the speakers, "I was a man who believed that success was measured by bank balance. a man who thought that control and order were more important than love and compassion. The audience listened in respectful silence, many holding their own rescued pets. Today I look at each of you and see family. I look at every animal we've rescued and see purpose. What began as a desperate attempt to escape the mess that 12 puppies could cause in my perfectly organized life has become the greatest gift I could receive. At that moment, something extraordinary happened. Daisy, who was sitting beside him, stood up and placed her paw on his hand, as if to confirm his words. The audience sighed with emotion. "This center is not just a rescue facility," he continued with tears in his eyes. "It's a testimony that it's always possible to start over. That love, especially the unconditional kind that our animals offer us, has the power to transform even the hardest hearts." Helen, with her serene smile, watched the scene with maternal pride. Her small farm had transformed into a national reference center, and more importantly, had transformed lives, both of animals and humans. "And now," James concluded, "I have a special announcement to make. From today, the Wells Baker Rehabilitation Center will become an international foundation. We are expanding our mission to other countries, bringing hope and second chances far beyond our borders." The applause was deafening. Daisy, surrounded by her puppies and the hundreds of other animals she had helped welcome over the year, seemed to smile. Her look at James no longer carried any trace of hurt or distrust, only pure love and the certainty that sometimes the greatest mistakes can lead to the most beautiful new beginnings. And so, under the bright sun of the Catskills, a story that began with abandonment and despair transformed into a beacon of hope and love, proving that it's never too late to change, to forgive, and most importantly, to start anew. Dear listeners, we hope that James and Daisy's story has touched your hearts. To continue sharing transformative stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Your experiences and reflections are very important to us. Share in the comments your own stories of transformation and new beginnings. Together we can make a difference in the lives of many other animals who, like Daisy, just need an opportunity to show the power of unconditional love.